Well, thanks for having me. And I will just move this one. Yeah, okay. Cool. Well, thanks for having me. I would have loved to come in person. That's a bit too far. Yeah, so I will present this paper that I am doing with my, I just moved the live screen of Steam there. Right, that I'm doing with my PhD. It's an empirical paper where we, well, our goal is two things, or our contributions are two things. So one is that we provide a new measure of religiosity, and that we can use for at the personal level and going back in history, and then we also contribute with estimating how religiosity influences science and modern growth. And so just to motivate, so lots of my research, it looks at religiosity and how this influences the economy. And this figure is just to motivate. It's nothing to do with the data in this paper. But yeah, so we look at religiosity, and also in this paper, and religiosity is the intensity of religious beliefs. So it's not about whether you're a Protestant or Catholic or Muslim or Christian, and that lots of research has already looked at, but we instead look at the intensity of beliefs. And the reason why I'm stuck in this and really fascinated about it is that it has extremely strong correlations with lots of things that we care about as economists. So here we see GDP per capita, and one survey-based measure of religiosity, the percent saying that religion plays a very important role in their lives. And we see this very stark negative correlation between the two. It says nothing about causality. That's what we will try to look at in this paper. Interestingly, this is the US, the little dot out over here, which is the big outlier in this field here, that it's a rich country, which is also quite religious. We have Brazil up here that fits this pattern very well.
So Max Weber is kind of happy with that, right? With this outlier, bringing his point.
Perhaps. Well, Max Weber is more looking at like Protestants versus Catholics. So actually, sometimes we accidentally think that Weber says either religion is bad or good, but it really depends on whether you're Protestant or Catholic, what he said. Yeah. All right. But before seeing that figure, we don't know whether religion is, or religiosity is good or bad for economic development. Especially if we go very far back in time, we could maybe have thought that religion was a good thing. There's and it might have been that. So, for example, there's lots of examples. Big universities, they were. Most of them were actually established by monks close to monasteries. So this is the Sorbonne in, or this is Notre Dame, but the Sorbonne in Paris, big university, was established next to this monastery, and because of this, and we have also examples of monks inventing lots of important things. But on the other hand, we also have examples of the opposite, that religion was bad for science and bad for innovation. So the most famous example is here we have Galileo Galilei, who was trialed by the Catholic Church for his view about who was in the center, the sun or the earth, and stuff like that. So here, this is an example of how there can be a clash between religion and science, and this is what we will be looking at. The question is, did religion impact the development of science and eventually modern growth, and in which direction? And we will I'll talk lots about how we test this, but our testing ground will be Europe between 1300 and 1940, the place and time for the emergence of modern science and economic growth. Because so if we want to study religion and its deep consequences, we want to go back in time. We also want to study it today, but that's not this paper. All right, so just some related literature before I dig into to this data here. So there's already some research on religiosity and science. So Joel Mokyr, he has talked about this. He says if the culture is heavily infused with respect and worship of ancient wisdom, so that any intellectual innovation is considered deviant and blasphemous, well, then technological creativity will be similarly constrained. Another set of papers have looked at this correlation between religiosity and innovation and technical skills. So they find a similar negative correlation so Benabou's paper, it's more of a theoretical paper explaining how this can be, that there is this negative correlation. And Mara Squitorini, she estimates the impact of religiosity in France across French districts, showing that schools in religious districts, they became less focused on technical skills and more focused on religiosity. Other papers, so these are papers on religious institutions that hampered the development of science, and another paper that religious activity crowds out time for other activities. So all these that I picked out here, they are more on the negative side of it, which is also what we will find. So that's why we relate very much to these papers here, but there's also lots of research showing that there can be positive effects of religiosity. For example, so there's papers on country level growth by Barrow and McCleary, and they show that religiosity can be good for bad for economic development, but once we account for religious attendance, so the time you spend on religion, then actually religious beliefs can be good for economic development. There's Guizou's paper on individual level economic outcomes, showing that religious individuals, they are less likely to commit crime and more likely to trust in government and well behave well in general terms. And then there's, I mentioned these already. Yeah, so Kampanda and Yagasawa Drod, they show that, well, Ramadan fasting as a measure of religiosity can be good for happiness. So the individuals are happier, but they produce less economic outcomes. So there is this very interesting divergence or that religion can have these both good and bad effects. And then, as I said, there's lots of research on these types of religion that we won't get into. There is also another related literature in that we look at growth. And so several papers have looked at what is it that determined the emergence of modern growth. One big determinant that they focus on is innovation, science, and technological progress. And that is why we will be, well, looking at science in this respect, because it's a big driver of modern growth. There's papers on the commercial revolution, which was important a bit earlier on. Papers on the Enlightenment and the importance of so-called upper tail human capital. Papers on the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation and the technological revolution. in the technological revolution, well, then science became increasingly important, even more important for economic development. And we will exploit that when we get to look at growth in the end of the paper. That so if science, if religion influences science, well, then religion should become increasingly, well, negative for growth as science becomes more important. But we will get back to that. All right, let's move on to the.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So you probably know this, but you're probably aware of this paper by Matias Cabello, that he has this paper on the counter-reform, right? Counter-reformation, and how it's really connected to these two literature, right? The strong reaction from the Catholic Church really diminished the number of scientists and further progress and even development down the road, right?
Yes. So actually, we see this as a paper on types of religion, but right. Yeah. So but you maybe could relate it to religiosity at some level, but yeah, but that's a really cool paper. Yes. Right. So the structure of my talk. So first, I'll present for you this new measure of religiosity, the concept of it. I'll present the data and some concerns, and then we will go through some of the very many validity checks that we have of this measure. So one thing is that we are saying that perhaps this measure works, and then we will test in the end whether it does. We will then move on to look at outcomes, the relation between religiosity and outcomes, both at the individual level. So we will look at science and religious occupations. And then we will be exploiting exogenous variation in religiosity, and last look at city level growth. Right, so measuring religiosity. So there is already existing measures. So one is the contemporary measures. People, including myself, have looked at surveys and our internet behavior. What we search for on the internet reflects whether we are religious or not, and many other things about our personality. Then there is historical measures. So first, I want to stress that, well, church density is not a good measure of religiosity, and this paper by Boring and co-authors show it really nicely that, well, churches, they capture economic prosperity just as much as religiosity. So we can't really use the density of, so how many churches are in a society? Well, it also really much reflects whether it's a rich or poor society. Poor societies don't build as many huge churches. There are, of course, exceptions, but it cannot be used to measure religiosity. A measure that seems to work really well is a measure by Mara Squicciarini on, she looks at the refractory clergy in France in 1798. With that measure, she can measure a district level religiosity in France in this year. There's another paper by my new colleagues here in Melbourne, fake cults, that they look at across Europe, whether you had a saint cult or not. Right, so what we will be doing is that we will aim to measure your parents' religiosity by your name. And so this is based on research by sociologists, psychologists, and anthropologists that on average, our first name reflects the identity of our parents. And so we're talking first names throughout here, and when I say name. And yeah, so a name, it's based on many different things. What is it that which name we choose for our kids? It's based on random stuff, of course, and that's out here, but it's also based on our well, unconscious or conscious focus on whether whether tradition is important for us, whether our ethnicity, aesthetics, do we think it's a nice name or not, whether we are individualists, do we give do I want my kids to fit in with a normal name, or do I want to give them a very special name that reflects my own individualism, my nationalism? Do I give them the name of a king, for example? General culture, my social status, and last, also my religion. And it's the latter that we want to focus on, and we want to try to account for all the rest. And so the hypothesis that we have is that religion played a larger role in the lives of parents who gave their child a religious name. And of course, yes, Marcus?
Yeah, sorry, Jeanet, I was just waiting for you to finish your sentence. You want to go ahead, or you want me to ask?
Yeah, well, of course. So there's one concern is that, well, your name just reflects your grandparents' identity, because name go in generations, and so therefore we can test that. We can test whether it reflects your parents or your grandparents, which is kind of neat. But anyway, it really doesn't matter so much to us. But it turns out that it mainly reflects your parents' religiosity. But yeah, we can see that. Yes.
Just to understand notation that you are presenting here. So I and J, they represent what exactly?
Yeah. So the name of individual J reflects the tradition and so on by their parents J. Or did I say in the individual I? It reflects the identity of his or her parents J.
All right. So then you don't deserve any. Okay. So everything is related to J. Everything except the individual.
Yeah, only the parent. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Right, and so we're not the first to use first names to reflect identity. So there's papers showing that your first name reflects your parents' focus on individualism. By my colleague in Copenhagen and Sophie, and also by Bassi and co-authors from the US. And there is also research. So this is by my own co-author here. He shows that names also reflect your ethnicity. And this older paper by Fryer and Levitt, who we will be very much inspired by. And names also reflect parental nationalism by other co-authors, not of myself, but yeah. And names have also been used to investigate the assimilation of immigrants. So if you come to a new country and your name quickly resembles, or your naming of the kids quickly resembles the society around you, we say that you assimilate quicker. And others have even assumed that the names shared with biblical figures, they reflect parental or Protestant religiosity. And we will be testing whether that is true and when it is true and stuff like that. So what we will be showing here is two different definitions of religious names. So first, we define a religious name if it is shared with a significant religious figure, and I'll be more exact about that in a second. And second, we refrain from defining which religious figures are significant or not, and instead say, well, a name is religious if it's very frequent among individuals with religious occupations compared to the rest of the society. Right, so let's just talk about the first measure. So how do we define a significant religious figure? So for Catholics, the most important religious figures are saints. And so we defined a saint as major or significant if a major European church built before 1500 was dedicated to him or her. And so you might think, oh, but why don't they choose small saints, like minuscule saints? So I have to be very religious to even know this saint. And the problem with that idea is that then we will get 100% religiosity because there's so many saints. And if we take small saints, they will encompass all names in society, and so that's why we focus on big saints. And to get this hands-off measure, we take this other data set by Buring and co-authors, and they have exactly these big European churches built before 1500 in their paper, and they show the name of the church and the saint to which it was dedicated. And we take simply all these names. And for the Protestants, the important figures are the relatives and apostles of Jesus. There is a huge overlap and they correlate very greatly because the apostles are also the names of their saints. So this is our main measure. Our measure 1 is a dummy equal to 1 if the name is shared by a significant saint or the relatives or apostles of Jesus, or Jesus himself, like Christian, or shared with names that include God. And we remove Muslim countries. So one concern is that saints are named very differently in different languages. And to homogenize that across all the countries, we get rid of the otherwise nice variation in the data, but we reduce all names to their common etymological branch using this etymology database behind the name. And so we reduce these 24,000 names into around 7,600 name branches. Another concern is that since we're taking these major saints, maybe we're just capturing normal names because they, randomly are named after normal people, these saints. So we fix this in 4 different ways. So first, we account for the commonness of a name throughout, and these individuals are actually less likely to hold religious occupations. But I'll get back to that. Right. So the second measure or the second fix is that we construct another measure. So this I talked about is a dummy equal to 1 if your name is a religious figure. We can also construct this other measure, and that's where we are inspired by this Fryer and Leavitt paper. This is our religious names index. It mimics the blackness of a name index by Fryer and Leavitt. And we do actually lots of stuff in the paper with this method here because we find it quite cool. So what it measures is that it's the frequency of a name among churches as a share of the frequency of a name among, the entire population or both churches and people. So for example, John is very common among the churches, but it's also very common among the entire population. And therefore we scale the name John. It probably doesn't reflect as much religiosity as the church data would have reflected. But if a name is only among churches, this measure gets the highest value of 1, and the name is very religious. Yeah, we can do the same, or we do the same for the Bible, the frequency of the name in a Bible compared to the full population. Right, and with that measure, we have completely removed this normality of names problem. The third fix is to look at the names that are not religious, and we actually see that these names are equally normal as names of saints because they're names of the kings, but I'll show you in a minute. And then there's the last fix is simply to define instead a name as religious if it was more common among people with the religious occupations compared to others. And there we are also completely remove that concern. All right, so let me present you to the data. So the data that we use to construct these measures and to test them and to test their consequences, well, is a database of authors. So we spent lots of time looking we wanted data where we could have people's first names and data that went far back in time. Well, actually, in the beginning, we wanted to go even further back, but that was not really possible. Right. So we have 500,000 authors, or I will call them authors, but they're not just authors. It's just anybody who wrote a text that ended up in a library. And they are born between, well, from 1300, we cut the data there. Well, there's not many people before that, but we cut it there because there we know that from historical sources that most people in Europe had Christian names. We want that, huh? Yeah, well, and I should mention here, so since we're looking at historical Europe, we will only be looking at Christian religiosity. Yeah. All right. So, and we we entered the data in 1940. That's because we downloaded the data a couple of years ago, and we don't want somebody who could enter the data to affect the data, right? So 1940, well, then the youngest person in our data was 80 years old, and we don't think that the likelihood of entering or getting a book in the library, if you haven't already gotten it, is high when you're above 80 years old. Right, and we have the information of the year of birth. We have geocodes for birthplace and death place. We have their name and we have their profession. We also do it all over again, everything I show you with another data set on 47,000 university students born in this very early period between 1300 and 1588. And it all holds through. Right, so there are some concerns, for example, about the representativeness of these people and also selection into the data set and how this can affect our results. And so we check that in various different ways, and we are able to remove these concerns. For example, name religiosity, it correlates with regional level religiosity, which means that we are pretty sure that it reflects, well, general religiosity here. We can look at current surveys, restrict them to people born early period and restrict our authors to be born late, and they actually kind of overlap there, which is nice, really cool. Yeah, and regional level religiosity also based on the historical sources from, for example, Marat's refractory clergy in France. We see that they correlate quite a lot. In addition, well, selection has to be of a very specific type, which will be evident when I go through the results. Also, we can try to make selection worse. So if there's selection into being an author, well, then there's probably more selection into being a good author and stuff like that. If selection drives it all, well, then results should strengthen when we do these exercises and they're not affected at all. And last, well, we will exploit shocks to religiosity and we will get rid of it all. All right, so these are the top names. So here, among the 500,000 authors, the first columns shows the share of names that we define as religious. And we see here that, for example, 11% of the sample is named John, which is quite a lot. And so we check robustness by removing all these guys, and it holds. And the rest is it's pretty much relatives and apostles of Jesus. And so the the non-religious names we are also very interesting to look at. They are mainly names of kings. So we could have, a concern was that, oh, but these are then these very modern names that are very non-religious, but yeah, they're just as traditional, we would say. And just some summary statistics. So this is the share of religious names as we go through time, and we see that the data is not very good in the early period. So between 1300 and around 1500, it fluctuates quite a lot because there's quite a few people. But we see that around 80% of the names are defined as religious until around 1750, where it declines dramatically. And this is really coincides with the secularization of Europe very much. So just to show you, it's a little bit difficult to show you the spatial detail of this data. So because if I just show you the dots, they will overlap because there's so many. But here I have taken the average in small grids across, and then I zoom in on just Germany to show you the spatial detail of it. It's the same across all the other countries, and we see that it's not the case that we have spatial clustering. These people, religious and not, live in together and all over. So we have so much spatial detail that we can actually end up comparing people who are born within the same square kilometer. Yeah. All right, so we will check whether it is then the case that if you have such a name, you are a religious, or you are more religious, or well, your parents were, but we have only information on the persons here. All right, so we will look at their, we will check whether these people also are more likely to have religious occupations. We will also check, well, based on my other research on religious coping, whether they are then more likely to be born after earthquakes because their parents coped with the shock here. Well, the regional level religiosity measures, and then the alternative data set. Right, so on occupations, so we have information on their occupation, and they can have more than one occupation each person. Not that it really matters here, but there is between 1 and 24 occupations, but 99% have less than 6 occupations. And so just to illustrate, so this is really illustrates the entire paper here, this figure. So what we show here is that we split the people into those with religious names and those without religious names, and we look at the frequency of the words that describes their occupations. And we see over here among the religious names, well, they have pretty much most of them have these religious, or not most of the people with religious names, but the most frequent words here are religious occupations. Among the non-religious names, well, there are no like explicitly religious occupations here, and well, what we will do in the second part of the paper is we will test whether, because it seems to be a relation here that it's well, mainly scientists, well, engineers, and so on in this among the non-religious names. But important for right now is that the religious names have these religious occupations. But that's just a simple illustration. This could simply be a time trend that religious names, they become less frequent over time. Religious occupations become less frequent, than the other occupations go up. So we will test it econometrically. Yeah.
Janet, it's really curious to see that for religious names, you would see theologian as the major thing, right? Because my suspicion is that you would find a big overlap of, let's say, normal professions for both groups, but yes, you would have you know, a larger share of religious occupations for people that have religious names.
Let me clarify. I actually didn't explain it correctly, because these are not the frequency of the words within each, it's the excess frequency. So we calculate the frequency of the words for the religious names and the non-religious and subtract them. Yeah, yeah, that is very true. So there are some occupations that would top both. Yeah. Very
Otherwise,
good.
it would be really weird, right? Because theologians, they are not very, you know, frequent to see theologians around.
No. It's the excess frequency. Sorry.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Okay. So that motivates our econometric analysis here, where we regress your occupations for individual I in a grid cell that we can vary G and at a time T on their this dummy or any of the other religiosity measures. We have grid cell fixed effects and time fixed effects. Grid cell specific trends, but in the most flexible estimation, we also have grid cell by time fixed effects. By that way, we can then compare authors that are born the same place and in the same year, and individual level controls. Yeah, so these additional controls are, let me just list them. So they're the name commonness, the gender. And then, so this is part of the newer part of the paper here that I'm eager to see if you are convinced about. So we have socioeconomic status proxies. Here we have calculated the urbanness of names, or the nobleness, or university names, the frequency of names among university students, and last name fixed effects. I'll show you. So let's talk when we get there. We control for their ethnicity, how much they have migrated by subtracting birth and death distance, place, urban dummy, Protestant area, and we also look at the heterogeneity across these. So results are the same in Protestant and Catholic areas. And then we can play around with the grid cell fixed effects and go all the way down to 1 by 1 kilometer. And so we define an occupation as religious if it's mentioned as a religious Christian occupation in Wikipedia, and we also have this old list of German occupations, because these data, the main data is from German library, and so the occupations are listed in German. Yeah. So yeah. All right. So let's just focus on the top of the table here in panel A. Here we have as a dependent variable the religiously associated occupation dummy, and main explanatory variable is this religious name dummy. And we see that they are highly correlated, and so having a religious name makes it more likely to have a religious occupation. We throw in the number of professions or occupations in here, just to make it that it's not a mechanical relation here. We throw in a female dummy, a common name measure. But what is really interesting here is, and then we have the, this is 100 by 100 kilometer grid cell fixed effects that we include here. But what really matters, and we see that the estimate is pretty much unchanged, even though R squared actually increases here throughout. Okay, but what we see here is that when we include the birth year as a trend, we see that we cut off half of the effect. So some of what I showed you in the words clouds, they are just trends over time, but there's lots of impact still remaining in the effects here. Then we include the year fixed effect, and we do that throughout whatever I will show you. And last, we include the stricter or the more flexible specification, where we have grid cell and year fixed effects, and that will be our main specification throughout. And we see here that the size of this amounts to around 14% of the mean share of religious occupations, which is quite a lot.
And Jeanet, just out of curiosity, how do I'm sure that you perhaps have robustness for the size of the grid cell, I suppose, right? But why did you pick 100 by 100?
It seemed reasonable. Actually, in the beginning, we didn't think that we could. We didn't imagine that we could go. The screen sharing thing is in the way here. Let me see if I can click on it. I think it's this one. Yeah. Well, actually, also because we lose lots of observation when going down to 1 by 1 kilometer. Yeah. But yeah, so here we have the grid cells, and what I really find remarkable, because in the beginning I thought much of this may be institutions, that we have this area where people have religious names because, well, the church is strong in this area, and that will deter them from getting science occupations later on, for example. But it's actually not what's going on here. So if we just look at the fixed effects, so here we have the relation without any fixed effects. I have restricted the sample to the sample with the 1 by 1 kilometer fixed effects. And we see that as we include the fixed effects, the estimate really doesn't change very much. And that means that even though we compare in the beginning here, we compare authors that are born across the entire Europe, that estimate here is the same as when we compare authors who are born within the same 1 by 1 kilometer. So it tells us that it seems actually to be really at the individual level, that you get religious parents, they give you a religious name, and you then also choose a religious occupation later on. Whether it's your parents who make the occupation choice for you, that's a different matter, but we can actually check which one using the shocks later on.
Right.
But
I was just asking because eventually there is a non-parametric way, like in the same way that people in non-parametric econometrics, they do like of finding what is the optimal bandwidth. Because like you're saying, right, you want to shrink this grid size, but conditional having sufficient information on that, because as you shrink, maybe you're gonna miss a lot of information. So maybe there is an optimal, I'm just saying quotes here just because I'm not sure if it's optimal, but maybe there is an optimal way to kick off with an optimal grid, like in a parametric
oh, that's
way.
cool. Yeah. Cool. I'll look into that.
Okay, but
thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, and one more thing. So if we look at the R squared here, when we include these fixed effects here, it increases quite a lot. And so it means that it does matter for religious profession choice. If we just call the fixed effects institutions, it can be many things, but societal level factors, they do matter quite a lot. And this really tells us that, yeah, if we remove all that things that happened at the societal level, there's still something happening among the individuals, which is very interesting. Right. And the same here by spatial fixed effects, we lose much more, and we have the same conclusion. Right. All right. And we see, well, yeah, we see that it's really homogeneous if we look at these relations in bins, 100 bins, we see that it's very homogeneous across these individuals wherever they live and so on. Yeah, let's see. If you ask for it, I'll show you some of the rest. All right, so that was, well, check one of our measure, whether religious names correlate with religious occupations. Another check based on my previous research is religious coping. So this literature from psychology and sociology have shown that, or have argued that that people, when they are hit by an adversity, well, then they use their religion to cope with it. And in previous work, I show that, well, if we then look at surveys across the globe, we look at the subnational district where we measure people. And if earthquakes hit in between the waves of the surveys, well, then people become more religious. If that's the case, we can use that to check our measure. So we have here, I just want to remove this panel. Let me just try to see. Yeah. Okay. So we have these 25 earthquakes of magnitude 5 or larger that hit Western Europe between 1700 and 1940. There is a total of 9,000 authors that are born within 100 kilometers of these. So here we see the light gray, that's the full sample, but we don't want to compare everybody to those that are hit by earthquakes. So we do buffers of 500 kilometers, which is our main sample here. And we see that these earthquakes, they hit people mainly. There's lots of earthquakes in Greece, but that's not going to affect very much. Well, we can throw them out, but there's also quite few authors here. But they are pretty much spread out, but mainly in Italy and Southern Europe. Right. Okay, so we estimate now the religiosity of your name, or whether you have a religious name or not, on these earthquakes, whether you were hit by an earthquake in year intervals before your birth and after your birth. And we now don't have the narrow grid cell fixed effects because we define earthquakes that hit within 100 kilometers, so we don't want as narrow, and so on. So earthquakes influence many different things, not just religiosity. And so to try to get some of this, remove some of this, we remove authors that are born within 20 kilometers of the earthquake. And so this is what we estimate. So here we have your birth year, or your birth year +1, and we can then, well, this is just the estimates of one equation here, and we can see that, so if an earthquake hit within 5 years before your birth, well, then the likelihood of you getting a religious name is higher. Also, if it hit between 5 and 10 years before, 10 to 20 years before, and then it declines later on. And that's what I talked about, the grandparents. So if it's all driven by grandparent names, these would have been much more persistent, and they're not. And quite importantly for our identification is that earthquakes after your birth do not influence your name, the religiosity of your name. So we take that as a validity check of our measure. So I won't bother you with all the other measures that we do. So we look at only the surveys. That's kind of cool. So here we look at, so we restrict our sample to authors that are born after 1900 and people in the surveys that are born before 1950, I think, to make them overlap. And we see that people born in regions that have more religious names, well, they are also more likely to say in surveys that they are more religious. We can do it across the authors and do averages across regions of the surveys, but we can also do it across the surveys, do averages across regions of the authors. And in the latter, we can then, pretty cool, also include income and education. All right.
Jeanet, just let me ask one thing about the earthquake exercise. So this thing of before and after, I'm not sure, because I'm not the econometrics guy here. So you are treating this as a natural treatment and comparing comparables, or you're running a regression, just checking before and after. What exactly are you doing?
So this is an OLS regression. It's very, very simple. So it's an OLS regression of whether so you get a dummy if an earthquake hit within 5 years before your birth, and the other dummy, which is 10 to 5, it also turns on if there was another earthquake between 10 to 5 years before birth, and so on. Yeah, so it's a regression with them.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an all-less regression with dummies.
I see. So then my question is, your hypothesis that after a natural shock, a natural disaster, people tend to get more religious. Is that so? Something like that?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so what I've been looking at in my other research is different natural disasters. So the hypothesis, the religious coping hypothesis, it says that so people tend to use their religion to cope with big negative events that are surprising. Right. And so I show that, for example, storms do not have the same effect. And stuff like that, yeah. And another thing I can show is that it's not so much that people use their religion to get material help, for example. They mainly use their religion to cope emotionally with these events here. Right. And so the idea in this earthquake exercise in this paper is that so the parents got hit by an earthquake, and they are friends and relatives then in surroundings got hit by earthquakes, and this makes them think more about religion and use their religion more intensely in life. And if they then happen to get a baby at this point, well, then they're more likely to give that baby a religious name, because religion is more important for them in this time of life.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking of because this seems like a natural treatment, right? Like a natural event, right? Like a natural experiment, like an earthquake. It's a random thing that took place in some part of time, in some particular point of Earth, and then you can somehow compare those who are under this treatment and those who are sufficiently close or sufficiently far, just to see if there is a statistical difference between these groups that are being treated by the earthquake or not.
Yeah, so that's actually the most recent part of our paper that I'll show you. We also use it for the occupations. Yeah.
Sure. All right.
Yeah. Right. So now we will take the measure as given. And now I hope that I convinced you that these religious names, they reflect something about religiosity of the parents. And then we will move on to use that to test whether test the impact of religion on outcomes. First at the individual level, occupation choice and study choice among the university students, and then last aggregated to cities. So the occupations that we will look at is the science occupations. So we define an occupation as within science if the person's occupation is included in the list of scientific occupations in Wikipedia, or whether they relate to engineering. And so here again, we look at these excess frequencies of the occupations and see that so among those that we define as scientists, we have mainly or the excess occupations are doctor, chemist, engineer, university teacher, mathematician, physicist, botanist, archaeologist, geologist, veterinarian. And the non-science occupations here, what's important now is that we note that this is not just the opposite of what I just showed you. It's not just that we have all the religious occupations over here. We see the theologian there and the pastor, but otherwise we have other occupations. And a very important check is that we remove the religious occupations in this analysis for robustness. So it's not just the flip side of what I just showed you. Okay. Right, we run exactly the same just with science occupations. All right, and so here the panel A is same as before, but just with science occupations as the dependent variable. And down here, we do the same with excluding the religious occupations. And that was, by the way, the same we did in panel B in the previous one, where we then excluded the science occupations, which gave the same results. All right, so here we see that having a religious name, well, it makes you less likely to take up these natural and occupation within natural science and engineering. Yeah, it lasts throughout and stuff like that. Yeah, well, actually, one thing that I think is interesting is, then I should have shown you the same for the religious. So one thing is that over time, we see that, well, in the previous, we see that the religious names, they actually don't work so well in the very early period here. And as a signal of your religiosity. And we find the same with the relation between religious names and science. It's not really there in the early period. But when we then move on, we see that, well, the relation between religiosity or religious names and science occupations, it's there throughout this earlier, later period. And maybe vanishes in the end, maybe not. All right, but so, oh, I don't have the socioeconomic proxies there. No. All right. So this can be, so even though we try to account for these socioeconomic factors and so on. Now let me actually just show you those socioeconomic status. Sorry, this is for the religious occupations. Okay, so, but one concern, let me just motivate. So one concern is that this is because, so your parents give you a religious name, but they also give you lots of other stuff. And these other things could be what's driving the relationship. And that's what we're concerned about now. And so for the first step is that we try to account for the socioeconomic status of the parent. And next we do the shock. Okay, so here we account for the socioeconomic status of the parents in different ways. So here we include this. So remember the measure where we have the frequency of the name among churches compared to the rest. That's like the religiosity, another religiosity measure. We could do the same for urban names. So here the idea is that your socioeconomic status is reflected in your name. And so we can then account for the frequency of names among people living in cities compared to the full population. We can account for that. And also we know whether the people were noble or not in the university data set. We can calculate again the frequency of the name among nobles and things like that. And we can account for that. And we can account for another used measure in the literature is last name fixed effects to measure your socioeconomic status. So we compare people with the same last name. We don't remove much, but we remove some of the variation. And we see that the relation holds. Right. Okay. But we may not have removed it all. And that's why we want to use the earthquakes as shocks, as we already talked a little bit about. Right, so, well, of course, and the main problem with using the earthquakes as shocks to religiosity when we want to estimate the impact on occupation choice is the exclusion restrictions. So what we are after is that there is an emotional effect of an earthquake hitting which can influence your religiosity. This can, so in my previous research, I show that if we actually remove the areas that are hit by earthquakes, there is still effect. And so the idea is that your family was hit by an earthquake. They live further away, and that makes you use your religion to cope with that. So that's what we will exploit in the following exercise. Yeah,
Jeanet, I have a question. So for the same reason, so why should we expect parents to feel more emotional when they are kilometers and kilometers away? You know, that's one thing. And the other thing is like, how can you exactly exclude the fact that earthquakes might make like this, let's say, people to value more professions like engineers, geologists, and people who can help with the catastrophe. So
exactly.
yes,
That's exactly the exclusion restrictions that I want to check whether you're convinced with the exercises that we will be doing. Yeah, that's exactly what we are worried about. Yeah, because then there is this emotional effect, but then there's also the destruction effect that you just explained.
Okay, that's your destruction, I see.
Yeah, and that's what we want to get rid of, this one. And that's what we will have different methods to do. And so one method is to exploit the time variation. Because the earthquake, it shouldn't influence naming, like earthquakes in the future after your birth shouldn't influence your naming, but they can influence your occupation choice. And we can look at these patterns here. This is not a perfect exercise, but we try these different methods and see if you're convinced. So I'll show you how this varied here. The other method is that we remove people that are born within 20 kilometers. It's not a lot. We just see the recent earthquakes. Well, earthquakes destroy many different kilometers further away than 20 kilometers. So this is just like to remove some of it. And also our treatment is actually also not perfect, right? Right now we have that we define a person as hit if an earthquake hit within 100 kilometers, well, between 20 and 100. But it could be that people in the control group are also treated, right? The earthquakes often have further reaching effects. But yeah, so this is how we do right now. Okay, so to get a little bit more of the exclude, let me just go through the methods and then we can talk. And the third method is that we then exploit that. So remember, we are after trying to isolate the emotional effect. And so what we then can do is that so if I'm born here and an earthquake hit in my own country and in the neighboring country, if it's an emotional effect that it influences my family and so on, well, then I should be more affected by the earthquake in my own country compared to the neighbor country, even though they're exactly the same distance. You could still come with arguments that, well, for helpers and so on, they are more likely in your own country. But yeah, so it's not perfect, but this is one thing that we do. And the last one is that we only look at those who live in a different place than they were born. So here we have a person who was who was born in one place. This is not illustrated correctly. Actually, the earthquake should be over here where they were born, and then they move here, and then we see an effect of the earthquake in the area where they were born, and we remove their location there. Yeah, okay, so Marcus first and then Raphael.
No, actually my question is because I think you are trying to somehow bring down the emotional effect doing this way, these methods. I was just thinking in any other particular method that because destruction effect is somehow measurable, I guess, right? Because you get to observe either through economic activity or you can also measure through the decrease in the professions over time. So for instance, if a major earthquake, devastated the whole city, you won't see people working retail sales, for instance. So then you measure to get something there, like, okay, this is really devastated. There is a destruction effect here. And maybe people instead of, working in normal occupation, they decided to go to religious occupations. Or the same with army. I don't know how is the army enlisting in European countries, but maybe there is a crowd out effect, like, people go to army because they can get a wage for, I don't know, I'm just, throwing some ideas here just to measure the destruction effect instead of trying to pin down the emotional effect right away.
Yeah. So we can, I'll show you the different effects on the professions, the direct effects, and it's difficult to explain by other things in my mind, but I'm eager to see what you think. But it's a good point that we could. So I'm not sure if we have retail professions in there, but that could be cool to look at. Yeah. If there is, but they don't write much that ends up in libraries. But yeah. If there are some occupations among authors that should be very likely to cope with the destruction effects of disasters, that could be really cool. But we haven't come up with any yet.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, Raphael?
Yeah, I was trying to understand method 4, which I thought would be the most convincing, but because you're looking at migrants, right?
Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, you look at someone who was born, let's say, in Italy, and maybe he was hit by an earthquake there, or his parents were, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're looking at an earthquake before he was born, in the 30 years before he was born.
Exactly.
And you know that he migrated to Germany or something.
Yes, because we know where he died.
I see. So you look if he became a doctor in Germany. That's what you're doing.
Actually, we don't know where he became a doctor. So he could have died in Germany and had his whole life in Italy. We don't know. We just know their points and their profession.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So So in this exercise, we just remove everybody who died, who were born and died in the same place, and just Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So this is our attempt to do all that. So the dependent variable is then, and that's also crucial for this, to look at the different effects across the different analyses. So we have the religious name in the first column as dependent variable. Then we have religious occupation and scientific occupation. So let me just walk you through this. So first, we have the same figure that I already showed you, that earthquakes before birth increase the likelihood that you get a religious name, but not after. Then we do next method, which is to split whether the earthquake hit in your country or not. And here we see exactly that earthquakes hit in the same country. That's what's driving it all. It's not earthquakes. Yeah, that's what earthquakes, and it's not earthquakes, well, after birth in the same country. And that really tells us something about the emotional effect in our mind when it's this naming decision. Yeah. That an earthquake hit in your own country, that's what matters. But here it could just be the distance. So in column 3, because earthquakes in your own country are closer. So in column 3, we account for the distance to the earthquakes. They have the expected sign, the distances, but whether or not an earthquake hit, it still matters within this same country. And in column 4, we then restrict to those that were not born in the same place as they died. So this is for the naming. Then we move on to the religious occupation choice, and we see that there is actually nothing if we don't take account for this within same country heterogeneity here. And we see that for the religious occupations now, and this is crucial. So here we see that earthquakes that hit in the same country before birth, well, they influence your religious occupation choice, but also earthquakes that hit after, and this is 20 years before after, okay, always. But also earthquakes that hit after. So the earthquakes that hit before birth, that's maybe, so these are earthquakes that influences your parents' religiosity, maybe influenced your religiosity through that, but also perhaps influenced your parents' occupation choice for you. And then we have the earthquakes after birth. It doesn't prove that you chose yourself now, because it could just be that earthquakes hit after birth, your parents become even more religious and they choose your occupation. It doesn't really matter much, but it makes sense that now earthquakes after birth also matter for your occupation choice. And when we then go to the migrants, it makes sense even more, because now earthquakes after birth in the same country shouldn't matter anymore, because we have focused on those that moved away from this place with earthquakes. Yeah, so this makes sense in terms of these emotional effects. Well, it could also cover the exclusion restrictions, but it becomes harder and harder. Then we have the science occupations. We see that earthquakes, well, before and after birth influence your science occupation choice. That makes sense. We see that it's mainly the earthquakes in your home country. And we see, well, controlling for the distance, and we see that it's still there if we remove the people, if we only restrict to the people who are born in a different place than they die. And so here we see then that earthquakes, they, well, so for the exclusion restrictions to explain this, we would have to have something that reduces the science occupations and increases religious occupations. That's not something to do with religiosity, and which does it just in your home country, and which does it even if you have moved away. And we find it, well, harder to explain. Oh, I just want to move you a little bit. All right, and so just to look at these exclusion restrictions a little bit more, if you're not completely convinced, because oh, sorry, maybe this is a bit confusing because now we are on city growth. Because, okay, so what I just wanted to show you is actually that the exclusion restrictions may actually go against us, which literature also has shown that earthquakes can actually, well, increase, be good for growth and stuff like that. And so here we see that the earthquakes before birth are actually good for economic development, perhaps creative destruction, or igniting people's curiosity, and stuff like that. Yeah, that's actually all I have for you about these exclusion restrictions and science choices. All right. Okay, so how am I on time? I don't see my clock anymore here.
So it's yes, we are almost done here. So, but yeah. You can take, you know, a few more minutes if you want.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool. So let me just show you briefly the link to economic growth. And so we measure historical economic growth based on the population size of cities. We match it. We match our author religiosity measures now to cities in 100-kilometer circles in cities across Europe. And if I should just show it very quickly, let me just show you. This is the cities here scattered across Europe in balanced samples and not. But if I should just show it you without the econometrics, if we split the cities based on the medial level of religiosity in 1300 to 1600, and then just calculate city sizes throughout time, we see that, well, in the beginning, and the dark one is high religiosity, gray one is low. In the beginning, there may be a tendency for the religious cities to be bigger, and over time we see that, well, the lower religiosity cities, they tend to grow quicker than the high religiosity cities. And we test that econometrically and see that this is also what's going on if we have do all the econometrics. Yeah, one mechanism in the very end, one mechanism could be innovation. That's really what the literature has talked about, and we then match it all to data on innovators. 2.5 million innovators, they registered a patent between 1850 and 1950, and that's what we use. And we can see that having a religious name, more religious names in a city, so this is across 1,500 cities. So this is just a correlation. Having religious names, well, it means less innovators, inventors, and if we then, and we also see, so it makes sense, having more scientists in the cities means more innovators. And these things here, they seem to matter for economic growth. If they had that as the dependent variable, number of innovators was good for economic growth. So that may indicate that one mechanism for this impact on growth is that we get less innovation. Right, so that's it. I have hopefully convinced you that religion perhaps plays a larger role in the lives of parents who named their child after a religious figure. And so we check this in various ways, and we then move on to show that these more religious individuals, well, they are on average less likely to become scientists, engineers, or proceed with advanced studies. And as a result, these cities with higher religiosity, they experienced slower economic growth, and increasingly so as science became more important in production. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Jeanet. Do we have more questions? Corby.
Yeah, thanks. That's very, very cool, Jeanet. Firstly, the idea of using names is extremely cool, even though it's been used elsewhere. I mean, it's a great progress to apply to religion, and very cool to combine that with your earthquake identification stuff from your, I think, EJ, right? EJ paper. Yeah. And the only, I'm gonna give you one question because we're gonna talk later. So, have you tried to combine these estimates, especially when you're doing the identification with some sort of risk sharing variable, right? If there's, Red Cross in these cities and earthquake hits, perhaps the effects are less strong. If there is nothing there, the effect is going to be super strong.
Yeah. So, but it would have to be an institution that helps emotionally. Yeah. Because
our health, right? Takes care of the. I mean, this could ease, like, emotional pain as well, right? I don't know.
Yeah. That could be really cool to see. Yeah, to see somehow heterogeneity respect to alternative coping mechanisms.
Correct.
Yeah. I'll think about that.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Right, any more questions? Okay, and then I'm gonna release you, Jeanet, to see the sun rising in beautiful Australia now.
Yeah, it's light now.
There is light now. Good. So go enjoy your light and your sun, and then we catch up in, I think, 1 hour and a half with Corby, and 2 hours we talk. Thank you very much for coming.
And thanks for comments. And it was nice to meet you guys.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
In this way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeanet.
Cool. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.